In this episode, UL Lethbridge history professor Dr. Sheila McManus explores why borders are stupid. Most people today, if they think about borders at all, can be forgiven for believing that lines on a map are real things that serve useful purposes. By demarcating the edges of nation-states, they're responsible for everything from shoring up sovereignty, nationalism, and colonialism, to drawing the lines between us and them. However, if you take a closer look at these messy, invisible lines, you discover what they are best at, is lying to you. This talk explores why we believe the lies that borders tell us and why we shouldn't.
A shorter way of describing what I do is that I specialize in the history of invisible lines and have been obsessed with them for a really long time. From a childhood memory of taking the international boat ride down Waterton Lake and wondering why the other end looked the same if it was in another country, to my first book on the colonization of Blackfoot country, to my latest book, which is a comparative analysis of the histories of the Canada-US and US-Mexico borderlands in the North American West, I've spent a long time thinking about what we believe borders do versus what they actually do, and why we have those beliefs. The title of the talk, Borders Are Stupid, began as my response to a question that was kind of making its way around academic Twitter a while back. The question was either, what do experts in your field take for granted that would surprise people who aren't experts in your field, or sum up your field in 3 words? Either way, my response was, borders are stupid. Borderlands historians study the interconnected communities and spaces that straddle and resist borders in their categories, so we can talk for hours about their smoke and mirrors, their fictions, and their cruelty. But I don't have hours, don't panic. In the next 45 minutes, I am going to discuss some of the ways borders lie to you and see if maybe I can leave you with some trust issues. I will focus on what I think are the 3 biggest and most dangerous lies. The first is that borders are where they are supposed to be and have been for a really long time. After all, something about them seems old, genuine, natural, obvious, and a map without any of them looks weird. Second, if they are where they're supposed to be and have been there for a really long time, they're probably doing a really important job that we need and want them to be doing. Third, if they are where they are supposed to be and have been there for a while and are doing important jobs keeping quote-unquote us safe, then there's probably nothing we can or should do about any potential downsides. I'm going to challenge those lies by demonstrating that borders, as we think of them today, are very recent creations, and they are figments of our collective imaginations more than anything genuine or natural. Next, I will show that borders are not a harmless line of pillows, protecting you from whatever scary stuff is on the other side. Every border is a threat, every border has real and terrible consequences, and if you worry about some of those consequences, then we need to change our thinking about what borders do. And finally, I will show you that we can learn a lot from the history of borderlands communities in the North American West about how and when we can resist, question, and even reshape those lines. Most of my evidence for you tonight will come from my own work on the history of North America's Western borderlands, with some freewheeling tangents into global borderlands and contemporary border issues. So, lie number 1. Borders are where they're supposed to be, right? They seem real and old and natural. Well, no. Human beings have always had a sense of territoriality, and I'm not trying to suggest otherwise. But for most of human history, that territoriality wasn't about a fixed line on a map that you drew once and called it good. It was about family and resources, what you used, what you controlled, and what you could defend. Drawing a line one year did not mean that the same boundary would exist a year from now, because any agreed upon divisions depended on ongoing relationships and compromises. The way we think about them now as fixed, permanent lines on a map, demarcating precise pieces of sovereignty and nationalism, is a really recent human creation. Most of today's borders are less than 200 years old, and many are even younger. Most historians agree that the way we think about borders today is a result of a 2-step process from the 17th century to the 19th century. In the 17th century, as part of the Treaty of Westphalia, Western European states decided that they should have fixed and permanent borders and have complete sovereignty over what happened inside. It was no accident they agreed to this in the 17th century. They were trying to wind up more than a century of fighting over religion and, not coincidentally, were colonizing most of the rest of the world as quickly as they could, linking genocide and land theft with a pecking order for imperial glory. Respecting each other's borders and sovereignty wasn't just about what happened at home in Western Europe. It was also about recognizing European claims over other people's territories too. Okay, so they're not old, but they're natural, right? They seem to separate people in places that are different from each other, and a lot of them probably follow a mountain range or a river. What could be more authentic than that? Again, no. What started in Western Europe in the 17th century as a way to divide languages and religions solidified in the 19th as the modern phenomena of national identities coming to matter more than almost any other way human beings see ourselves. Only in the last couple of hundred years has it become normal to believe that nation states are rigid containers that miraculously correspond to distinct societies, separating a supposedly homogeneous and self-evident us from them. But a system that did not work well even in Western Europe, the really stupid belief that each piece of the map can and should contain a single language and ethnicity, was a disaster pretty much everywhere else. So let's look at the boundaries of the American, Mexican, and Canadian nation states across the West, and you'll start to see why I have a hard time taking any border seriously. Diplomats set the borders across Western North America in three main steps. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 set the 49th parallel as the border from the Rocky Mountains to the Lake of the Woods. Neither the US nor Great Britain cared very much about the Northern Great Plains at the time or had significant economic interests in the region, so they decided that since the 49th parallel and the headwaters of the Mississippi River and the Lake of the Woods all sort of overlapped somewhere, they thought that was as good a starting point as any to pick a border and run it west to the Rockies. Britain and the US also agreed to a joint occupancy of the Pacific Northwest in 1818, and each spent the next 30 years trying to shore up their colonial claims to the region, and that's the image you see now. This included some pretty extreme suggestions for where the final border should be. Britain wanted a border at least as far south as the Columbia River, and at one time hoped to claim as far south as the 42nd parallel, now the northern edge of California, but in 1818, still the northern boundary of Mexico. The United States' most ambitious claim was for everything up to the 54th parallel, now the southernmost tip of Alaska, and at the time, the southern edge of Russia's claims. By the 1840s, neither had the political will to really maintain those ambitions anymore, so in 1846, they agreed to the 49th. On the other side, the US and Spain had signed the Treaty of Adams-Onís in 1819. But after the 1846-48 US-Mexico War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo took the northern third of Mexico and handed it to the US, pushing the border much further south. In 1853, the Treaty of La Messier, or the Gadsden Purchase, adjusted one portion of the border southward so that the US could get a straighter line for a railroad to Southern California. Okay, good. A bunch of diplomats and politicians agreed to some boundaries in Western North America. The next step was to actually survey the borders and draw them on official maps. Sovereignty, after all, needs to be seen, perhaps especially when it comes to invisible international boundaries that have no meaning for local communities. Surveying seems like a nice objective activity, right? Again, no. For all of the obvious differences in the imperial, national, military, and local contexts that led to the creation of these borderlines, there are some telling similarities between the 1849 to 55 survey of the US-Mexico border, the 1857 to 62 survey of the 49th parallel west of the Rockies, and the 1872 to 74 survey of the Canada-US border between the Great Lakes and the Rockies. The first problem was that none of the survey parties or the governments they represented knew much about the borderlands. Treaty negotiators had cobbled together the US-Mexico boundary, for example, from a patchwork of rivers and older boundaries. So the surveyors had to contend with old maps that did not match the treaty instructions or geographic reality. At one point, the US and Mexico survey teams had to decide whether they should measure and map from where El Paso and the Rio Grande were actually located or from where they had appeared on older maps of the region. They decided it would make more sense to measure and map from where they actually were, But their bosses said no, and they were ordered to ignore reality and proceed based on the old, incorrect maps. The two separate surveys of the 49th parallel at least had the luxury of following a single, straight astronomical measurement and had only three major points of contention: the northwest angle of the Lake of the Woods, San Juan Island, and Point Roberts. That shows you the third. When British and American negotiators agreed that the 49th parallel would be the border between the Lake of the Woods and the Rocky Mountains, they were working with maps that made the lake look like a nice oval. They agreed to draw a line from the, quote, northwesternmost corner of the lake, either up or down, until the line meets the 49th parallel, and go west from there. Again, to a bunch of white diplomats and politicians who'd never set foot anywhere near the lake or the 49th, this seemed very fair and gentlemanly, and everyone signs off. 5 years later, the US Secretary of War sent Major Stephen Long to determine and mark the location of the 49th parallel in relation to the lake. In August 1823, the surveyors do their work, and they left behind an oak post with the letters GB carved on the north side and US on the south. More surveyors in the 1820s tried mapping the Lake of the Woods, but could not decide which part of it would count as the northwesternmost corner, because in reality it looks like that. In the 1840s, somebody else got the job of locating whatever the northwesternmost corner was going to be, and this time around they left a wooden post to mark where they thought the spot was. Both nations then ignored the boundary until some minor disputes in the late 1860s over the location of a Hudson's Bay Company fort and a US Army post, and Canadian jitters over potential expansiveness of a post-Civil War US prompted a formal survey to finally go ahead. When the teams began their work in 1872, the head of the British Canadian Survey, Captain Cameron, annoyed the Americans for 2 years by refusing to accept the opinions of his own chief astronomer, the Americans' chief astronomer, and local Ojibwe about the location of that wooden post from the 1840s. They literally kept saying, no, it's right there. And he'd be like, no, that can't be it. His delay had everything to do with imperial and national fantasies, because it was obvious that the northwestern corner of the lake was well north of the 49th parallel, meaning the US was going to get to claim what is now known as the northwest angle. The British government finally ordered him to concede the point in the summer of 1874. At the western end of the 49th parallel, another border mess was resolved in the 1870s, while a third problem, the exclave community of Point Roberts, was left as is. When that joint occupancy agreement between Britain and the US ends in 1846, the deal included a phrase where they agreed to use the 49th parallel as the border to the middle, quote, to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and thence southerly through the middle of said channel and of Fuca Straits to the Pacific Ocean. This gave Britain control over all of Vancouver Island, which was a key goal for them, but led to competing claims over tiny San Juan Island in the Strait of Georgia. Britain and the US could not agree on what constituted the middle, and none of the 1846 treaty commissioners thought they needed to include a map, including where they thought the middle was. Britain argued that the only channels that counted were the ones that were surely deep enough to navigate with a boat, while the US countered that any body of water separating two islands is a channel, even if it's too shallow to sail a boat through. If the middle channel ran to the west of the island, then the US got it, and if the middle was on the east, then Britain was going to get it. During the 1850s, each side acted as if they owned the island. James Douglas, governor of the colony of Vancouver Island, was determined to assert British sovereignty, and he kept trying to claim a lot of even the smaller islands that weren't even in dispute. In 1853, he commissioned the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, a Hudson's Bay Company subsidiary, to start a 1,300-head sheep ranch on the island. In 1854, an American official tried unsuccessfully to collect taxes on the Hudson's Bay Company sheep. Another showed up a year later and seized some rams as payment for the back taxes. Over the next few years, the Hudson's Bay Company sheep farm was surrounded by American settlers, and each side pretended that the other had no right to be there. The formal boundary survey of the BC-Washington border finally got underway in 1857. Captain James Prevost with the British survey team suggested that the US could let Britain have Point Roberts in exchange for the island, but the British refused. In 1859, Great Britain and the US nearly went to war over the island in the so-called Pig War. In June of 1859, an American named Lyman Cutler shot a pig owned by the Hudson's Bay Company's sheep farm. This was not the first time the pig had gotten into his garden, and he'd had enough. He offered to pay a small amount of compensation for the pig, but the British magistrate on the island was so angry that he demanded a huge sum that Cutler was not going to pay. Both sides rushed troops and ships to the island. By the end of 1859, Britain had about 5 warships and 1,900 Royal Marines facing off against about 450 US troops. Those numbers declined in the 1860s. The US was busy with other things. But both sides kept a few hundred troops there through the decade, and the two sides just kind of coexisted amicably. They finally agreed to send the issue to arbitration, and an international commission gave the island to the US in 1872. They did not apparently think they had to fix the problem with Point Roberts. The BC-Washington survey had made it clear that the 49th parallel ran through the southern tip of Tsawwassen Peninsula. A little chunk of territory is south of the 49th and therefore belonged to the US, even though the only way to access it by land is through Canadian territory. As I mentioned, there had been a couple of efforts in the 1850s to just agree to a swap, but first the US and then Great Britain just said no. So to this day, people who live in Blaine but work in Point Roberts, or maybe live in Point Roberts but go to high school in Blaine, have to go through the whole border crossing thing twice a day. Okay, so you've signed a treaty, you've sent out your surveyors. You have their reports and some nice new maps, and you're sort of crossing your fingers that no one looks too closely at either of those things for a while. So you're done, right? Sovereignty achievement unlocked. Again, no. Now comes the hard part. Convincing people who have no reason to believe you that those lines are real and supposed to mean something, and could they please stop moving the border markers? Even the few physical traces of the mid-19th century border surveys the government officials across the continent had been so proud of were quickly destroyed, repurposed, relocated, or ignored by borderlands communities. The post that Major Long pounded into the ground in 1823 at the northwest angle was promptly twisted halfway around, so that the GB was on the south side and US was on the north side. A mocking testimony to some confusion over the border's exact location and its significance. 50 years later, along the 49th parallel, east of the Rockies, the little wooden posts the surveyors left behind became handy sources of firewood for indigenous communities and scratching posts for cattle. And the piles of rocks that had been built every 5 miles were easily scattered by animals and the elements. Officials frequently complained in their reports about the fragility of their border markers, wishing they had the money to build more durable ones. Because if an invisible border doesn't have some kind of marker, is it really a border at all? The border survey's traces fared better in their absence. That is, the 30-foot gap that they cut through the few sections of the border that had enough trees could not be ignored or repurposed. You just have to keep cutting it every few years. Similarly, there's an apocryphal Southwest folktale in which a Mexican man noticed that the new border line, which appeared after the 1853 Gadsden Purchase or Treaty of La Mesilla, now cut through his land, leaving part of it in Mexico and part of it in the US. So he just moved the rocks that the surveyors had placed so that they all ran along the northern edge of his property. That treaty was so unpopular with locals in Sonora, Mexico, that locals regularly defaced the monuments that the US and Mexican surveys had erected. Still, borderlanders' rude behavior aside, Mexican, American, and Canadian officials could now at least point at their maps and say, this is mine and that is yours. They genuinely believed that having fully surveyed borders was the final proof for their nationalist fantasies. The surveys themselves helped the process in more ways than just drawing lines on a map. For example, the 3 different governments involved in surveying the border across the northern Great Plains couldn't agree on a name, so they each had their own name for it. The Americans called it the Northern Boundary Survey, the Canadians called it the International Boundary Survey, and the British called it the British North American Boundary Survey. That is, the American government was really primarily concerned with its own territory. The Canadian government was trying to exert its new national status and dominion over the West, and the British government was trying to exert a continuing claim over the Canadian West, which it had just recently handed over to the new Dominion. The survey teams also took pains to reassure their superiors that the lines were indeed perfectly placed. Mexico's chief surveyor, for example, noted that the unsurpassed beauty of the Mexican landscape filled him with national pride. William Emery, head of the American team surveying the border with Mexico in the 50s, concluded in his official report, "It is fortunate that two nations which differ so much in laws, religion, customs, and physical wants should be separated by lines." Some of the American surveyors were unimpressed by the land that they passed through, writing bluntly that the bleakness of the landscape suited it to nothing else but a border, utterly worthless for any purpose than to constitute a barrier or natural line of demarcation between two neighboring nations. 20 years later, Captain W.J. Twining, the chief astronomer for the 49th Parallels American Survey Team, happily asserted that, quote, "the northern border of the U.S. was perfectly located because the land and people north of that line had little value, and the land and people south of the line were blessed with every advantage." The head of the Canadian team, Cameron, was equally pleased to insist that the Canadian West was superior, in his opinion at least, because the Canadian government treated Indigenous peoples better than the Americans did and had made better policy decisions, thus avoiding the so-called Indian Wars that the Americans had brought upon themselves. All three settler colonial nations finally had lines on a map, a sovereignty that could be seen, and a nascent national identity to promote that hinged on being different from, and certainly better than, the folks on the other side. What they did not anticipate was how hard it was going to be to convince people to see those lines the way they did. So this brings us to line number 2. We're here for your own good. So maybe the lines aren't that old or natural, but that hasn't stopped most people in the modern world from believing that separating me and my nation from you and yours is a good thing. In 1874, Canada's Minister of the Interior, David Laird, wrote that uncertainty about the exact location of the international boundary line had in the past led to difficulties and disputes, which might have led to grave international complications. So in the interest of peace, as well as on other grounds, the authoritative determination of this missing link in our international boundary line cannot be but a source of satisfaction to the imperial and Dominion governments. Good fences make good neighbors, right? Again, no. Being a borderlands historian means that I am also by default a historian of nationalism, because it is at their edges that nation states need to work the hardest to invent and enforce their national identities. Nationalism is basically a branding exercise. You need to convince people that there are obvious and profound differences between, say, Pepsi and Coke, or McDonald's and Burger King, when they're really just two versions of kind of the same thing. This branding exercise is a little easier if you happen to be an older nation state with a longer history, and it helps if you speak a different language or prefer a different church than the country next door. But even for those countries, nationalism requires constant maintenance. Settler colonial states have an even bigger hill to climb because their newness and artificiality is right there for everyone to see. As I mentioned in the surveyor's reports, they had to start inventing a history and a personality as evidence for their claims to sovereignty, and then hang all of that on their borders. Border enforcement regimes decide who belongs and who doesn't, who can come in and who can't. That is, borders have to have consequences, even if, or perhaps especially because, especially when, they are invisible lines. And that interlocking relationship between borders, sovereignty, and nationalism has created and continues to create real and terrible consequences. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about 3 issues in the world today that may concern you to one degree or another, and show how the lies we believe about borders have helped create the problems. Let's start with reconciliation. Maybe you are a settler Canadian who genuinely cares about learning the truth about Indigenous histories in Canada and wants to see this city, province, and nation do more to work towards a better future with Indigenous nations. If so, then you need to care about borders. We're here in Siksikaitsatapi territory, a homeland that Canada and the US cut through in the 19th century without a second thought. And the Niitsitapi annoyed Canadian and American officials for years by refusing to accept the division. In 1870, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Sully unironically complained about the Blackfeet in Montana Being a wild, uncivilized set, they of course do not take into consideration any treaties we have with Great Britain in regard to our boundary line, but look upon the whole of the country, both north and south of the line, as theirs. In 1871, another official in Montana, Indian Agent J. Armitage, wrote, also with no sense of irony, that the Blackfeet seemed to be governed by invisible boundary lines and expressed themselves as perfectly willing to remain in what they consider their own country. Crossing the 49th parallel remained a common occurrence for the Blackfoot until the early 1880s, and the American officials were a little frustrated that Canadian officials weren't actually trying too hard to stop them. In 1880, for example, Commissioner Edgar Dewdney acknowledged that since the Canadian government could not afford to feed all the Blackfoot who were starving in Canada, if they happened to supplement their meager supplies with hunting at a time when the only bison still to be found were south of the border in Montana, then so be it. The ongoing legal battle over the Big Claim stems from the early 1880s decision to move the southern edge of the Kainai Reserve northward away from the 49th parallel. The original edge of the reserve was supposed to go all the way to the 49th, but it was suddenly moved 5 miles north when the reserve was surveyed in the early 80s. One of the main reasons was to get the southern edge of the Kainai Reserve away from the border. The northern edge of the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana did go all the way to the border. So if the Kainai Reserve went as far south as the border, there would be a continuous Blackfoot-controlled territory where it would be much harder for Canadian and American officials to stop Blackfoot people from moving freely through their own territory. The long-term consequences of these borders in Blackfoot territory today are still a painful and day-to-day reality for Blackfoot peoples. Back in September, I had the privilege of co-presenting a conversation at the Galt with Kainai elder Nina Pixie, more commonly known around town as Dr. Mike Bruised, about the Blackfoot borderlands. He shared stories with us that day about how there are sacred plants that grow on the Montana side of the line, but not the Alberta side. So Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika people have to go through the hassle of crossing the border to access that material and then aren't allowed to bring it back. He told us about customs officers who think they have the right to open ceremonial bundles and harass anyone bringing sacred items across. He mentioned that the Canadian customs officers were usually the problem, because the American officers have undergone an additional culturally appropriate training and the Canadians haven't. A different and better relationship with Indigenous nations simply is not possible if we aren't willing to address the ongoing damage settler colonial borders have created. Maybe a more pressing concern for you right now is genocide. There is never any shortage of news about the inherent violence of borders, but that violence only gets framed as a border issue when it's about nations trying to kill migrants. The US-Mexico border is the deadliest land route for migrants in the world at the moment, and the latest cruelty came last summer when the US strung razor wire across the most heavily used sections of the Rio Grande. They get away with it partly because we believe that's what borders are for, and it is within a sovereign nation's right to kill anyone crossing their border without permission. The acceptance of a state's right to kill people is not supposed to extend to genocide. Article 2 of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide has a clear definition: 5 acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. These acts include killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another. From my perspective as a borderlands historian, what is striking about Article 2 is that it takes for granted, and indeed does not even feel that it has to specify, that these are things you aren't supposed to do to people who live within a nation's borders. You aren't supposed to do some of these things to people outside your borders either, but if you do, it's called warfare. And the assumption is that another sovereign state is going to try and fight you to make you stop. It's called genocide when you're doing it to people inside your own borders. The reason why the UN adopted the Genocide Convention in 1948 is because it turns out some countries do think that sovereignty plus nationalism equals the right to massacre a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group that it doesn't want within its borders. When government officials are comfortable describing a group of people inside their borders as savages, or vermin, or animals, you are hearing the rationale for genocide. from Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, to the Armenian genocide in World War I, the Holocaust, Rwanda in the 90s, and Palestine as we gather here tonight in comfort and safety. And the reason why most of the other governments in the world will stand by and watch you do it, which is what we've witnessed for the last 7 weeks, is because they don't want anyone questioning their sovereignty within their borders either. It's hard to move on from that one, but I'm going to suggest one final area where we have to question the lies borders tell us if we are going to face an even bigger threat, and that is climate change. These tweets are from last June, when it was big news that New York City was blanketed with smoke from forest fires in Quebec. And each of these comments speaks to the fact that the climate crisis does not respect national borders, and the borders themselves are contributing to the problem. It's not just about the smoke from fires in one country affecting the health of people in another country, it's climate refugees being driven out of their homes because nation states in another part of the world refuse to make changes inside their borders that might hurt their GDP in some small way. Some scholars are estimating that in the next few decades, if not sooner, hundreds of millions of people are going to be compelled to relocate because of environmental pressures. Climate change is a global problem that is being caused in part by our beliefs in the lies borders tell us and will require transnational, border-defying solutions. Do I think that we can dismantle the Westphalian system of borders that has brought us to this point, where genocide and climate change are just a part of life in the 21st century? Do I think settler colonial nations are going to give back what they took anytime soon? Honestly, no. I do believe that we can start smaller by seeing the world through a borderlands lens. And it's easier than you think. So for example, raise your hand if you have ever been less than completely honest about the total value of the goods you were bringing back into Canada after a road trip or vacation. Should I have asked first if there were any Canadian customs officers in the audience? But you see how easy that is. Your impulse in that moment of border crossing is that it isn't really the government of Canada's business if you're coming back with $500 US worth of stuff versus only $250. Your impulse in that moment is to ignore the border. And yet, the third lie borders tell us is that they are not to be ignored or questioned. Tying sovereignty and national identity so closely to each other means that if you question any of the lies a border tells you, you will be described as unpatriotic or disloyal. Sort of like how the government of Alberta wants you to think it's un-Canadian to suggest that tying our identity and economy to fossil fuels isn't actually a very good long-term plan. Borders around the world have the same sad, small list of jobs they are supposed to do. Pick any two borders anywhere in the world, and their job descriptions will look disturbingly similar. But from my perspective, at least as a borderlands historian, what is even more amazing is that borderlands communities also have the same features, no matter where you are in the world. From constant small-scale smuggling to ongoing cross-border mobility and kin networks, what borderlanders see more clearly than anyone else is how artificial the lines are, how malleable and porous they can be. And they rarely lose sight of the fact that people on the other side of that line are family. Indigenous nations, for example, refused and have continued to refuse settler colonial states' bordered categories. In the US-Mexico borderlands, for example, the Tonawattum have refused to pick a side for nearly 2 centuries. The 1819 and 1848 borders left Tonawattum territory wholly in Mexico, but when the border was pushed south again by the Gadsden Purchase, the northern end of their territory was now in the US. To this day, the Tonawattum Nation disputes the validity, quote, the validity of the geopolitical border itself, demanding that O'odham on both sides of the border be recognized first and foremost as citizens of the Tonawattum Nation. In the borderlands of New York, Quebec, and Ontario, one of the many ways that the Haudenosaunee have continued to assert their sovereignty is issuing their own passports. I like this map because it shows it without any of the political demarcations. They repeatedly remind courts and elected officials in Canada and the US that both the Jay Treaty of 1794 and the Treaty of Ghent in 1815 contained explicit language recognizing and protecting Indigenous border crossing rights. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada signed, also protects the rights of Indigenous nations affected by international borders, but it does not seem to make any difference when it comes time for settler colonial officials to try and police Indigenous movement or territories. And it's not just Indigenous nations. They certainly have the most powerful reasons to challenge settler colonial boundaries by maintaining identities and kin networks that cross those lines, but they aren't the only ones. This is particularly evident in the US-Mexico borderlands in the 19th and early 20th century, largely because the boundary itself had moved a few times, and Mexico spent a century avoiding a racialized national identity. A person in those borderlands could have one national or ethnic or racial identity one day and a different one on another day, depending on the circumstances, which is antithetical to how national governments want those identities to work. For example, the residents of Beja, Texas lived under no fewer than 5 flags between 1821 and 1861, so their nationalism, by necessity, focused less on official symbols like flags and more on locally established cultural and ideological practices. Their everyday lives proved that Mexican and American identities were not mutually exclusive categories and not contingent on a specific territorial location. In those borderlands, as in most borderlands around the world, national identities are things you can put on and take off, like a mask, and that's not how governments want them to work. In our modern world, each person is supposed to have one and only one such identity, and among other things, it determines where you belong and where you don't. I want to conclude with a poem written by Warsan Shire. She was born in Kenya to Somali parents and migrated to England when she was 1. This is an excerpt from her 2015 poem, What They Did Yesterday Afternoon. They set my aunt's house on fire. I cried the way women on TV do, folding at the middle like a 5-pound note. I called the boy who used to love me, tried to okay my voice. I said hello. He said, Warsan, what's wrong? What's happened? I've been praying, and these are what my prayers look like. Dear God, I come from 2 countries. One is thirsty, and the other is on fire. Both need water. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, where does it hurt? It answered, everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. Borders ask us to hurt each other and convince us that it is necessary. Borders tell us that it cannot be otherwise, that we need them to be safe. Borders tell us that the world's problems are not ours if they happen on the other side of an invisible line. But we can see through those lies and react differently if we understand their histories and see the world the way borderlanders see the world. We all have kin on the other side of that line. Borderlands are borderlands because of their unique ability to keep some options open and create new ones in the face of what is supposed to be the enormous power of the nation state to control what happens at its edges. If you think from the river to the sea can only ever be an anti-Semitic phrase, it means you're believing the lies that borders tell you and are kind of proving the point that there's a short and slippery slope from Westphalia to genocide. When Jewish and Palestinian protesters can march together calling for a ceasefire, as we have seen them do by the thousands around the world, it's because they are thinking like borderlanders, refusing the violence and seeing each other as kin. Borders are stupid and they are cruel, but they only have as much meaning and power as we give them, and both sides need water. Thank you for your time this evening.
In the next episode, U Lethbridge New Media professor Christine Clark and Aboriginal health instructor Melissa Shouting help us understand the web as a space for cultural vitality.